If you've ever wondered what the effective compression actually sounds like, then stay tuned, because in this video we're going to find out. Hey guys, it's Steve from Featherlightstudio, and one of the hardest things for me to grasp when I was going to audio school as a young engineer was the concept of compression, like what it actually sounded like. Because it's a really subtle, or can be, a really subtle thing to pin down when you don't quite know what to listen for when you're just starting out. And unlike things like EQ that emphasizes a specific frequency and can be pretty obvious to hear, compression can be everything from very subtle dynamic control all the way up to flat out sound design and everything in between. It's one of the most versatile effects, but it's also one of the most transparent. So we're going to dive in and check out the major categories, the different kinds of compressors, and then hear what each one of them sound like to get a better understanding of this complex but vital audio tool. Audio compressors are invaluable tools in the field of mixing and audio engineering. So they help control the dynamic range of the audio signals, they make them more consistent and manageable. And there are several types of audio compressors out there, each with its own unique characteristics and applications. And all these kinds of major categories of compressors are now available in both hardware and software or digital versions of themselves. If you simplify everything back down to its analog hardware components or references, there was really only four widely used styles of analog compressors: VCA compressors, or voltage-controlled amplifiers; opto, or optical-controlled compressors; FET compressors, or field effect transistors; and Vari-Mu, or all-tube compressors. Of course, there were some unique standouts and exceptions to the rule, like pulse width modulation, PCM, or diode bridge-style compressors, but these are the four major analog compressors that most of the modern-day digital emulations came from. And then the fifth category of compressors that are widely available today would be the digital compressors. And this includes things like dynamic EQs, multiband compressors, and all of the modern day emulations. One of the easiest ways to hear what the sound of a compressor actually is doing is to put a compressor in its most extreme settings. And one of the most obvious examples of that is in dance and EDM style tracks, because they use compressors really almost more for sound design, but it gives you a good idea of what the compressor actually sounds like. So in this particular case, we're using a very clean sounding digital compressor, which means it's not imparting any analog mojo or saturation into the sound. And we've simply strapped it or inserted it across the stereo bus on an EDM dance track. So first, without the compressor, the EDM dance track sounds like this. All right, so it's got a consistent 4-on-the-floor kick drum. We're going to use a process called side chaining to have our compressor listen to just that kick drum. And that'll give you a really good example of what this compressor actually sounds like. And one of the most probably recognizable examples of a compressor used as a sound design tool in a dance and EDM track. So as we start to drop the threshold slider here, the compressor is going to start waking up and doing something. It's going to start waking up and clamping down on the volume of that track. And it's going to do so by a certain amount. That amount is going to be the ratio knob here. And if we turn this up or down, the compressor is going to apply more or less compression. The attack knob is going to control how quickly that clamping down effect takes place, or whether or not the compressor will wait a certain amount of milliseconds before it begins to clamp down. The release knob is going to determine how fast the compressor goes back to sleep, basically stops doing something. And then there's some other knobs and stuff that we'll deal with here in the future. But for the time being, as we drop the threshold slider, the compressor is going to wake up and start doing something, and you'll hear that result. All right, so as you can hear, that pumping action is actually the sound of the compressor doing its job. And in this particular case, it's one of the most well-known examples because this is used a lot in dance tracks and things like that. And there are some other sort of things at play here. But in its most basic form, compression isn't that much different than somebody turning down your audio every time it exceeds the threshold level you've set with this control. We talked about the attack knob earlier, but in those examples, the attack was set at its fastest setting, which meant it affected the entire transient immediately. To make things a little easier to visualize, let's look at a graphical representation of our audio dance track. Here in our audio, we can see that the compressor goes immediately to work at the beginning of each one of the transients, meaning the kick drum. Only we can barely hear the kick drum because the compressor immediately clamps down. However, if we start to delay the effect of the compressor by changing the attack knob parameter, effectively delaying how quickly the attack will go to work, we can hear the first part of the kick drum start to sneak its way past the compressor before it has a chance to clamp down and turn it down completely. And this very predictable behavior turned out to be pretty effective at controlling very specific types of sounds. As compressors evolved, each one of the 4 compressor categories developed its own unique characteristics and musical application. Each one of these compressor categories started to be used for very specific purposes. First up is the all-tube compressors. The earliest tube compressors emerged in the 1930s and were primarily used in early radio broadcast and then later in recording studios. The compressors were large and bulky due to the all-vacuum tube design and analog circuitry, and they may have lacked a lot of the modern-day controls you find on digital compressors. Instead, the harder you drive the input signal to the compressor, the more ratio it applies, meaning the stronger the compression effect gets. These typically have slower attack and release characteristics than their more modern-day designs, which makes them very musical sounding without adding harsh artifacts to the audio. The slower attack and release characteristics of all tube compressors are great for things like vocal processing, instrument tracking, guitars, things like drum overheads and certain kinds of instrument group channels where you want to add weight and sustain to the signal, and because of that analog warmth and circuitry, it adds great subtle saturation and glues things together. In this example, we're going to be using the all-tube compressor called the Fairchild, which was known for its warmth and subtle saturation on a highly dynamic piano piece. First, the piano piece by itself. Then we'll turn on the Fairchild and listen to the weight and sustain of the part. And while we have the appearance of more volume, we're not increasing the levels on the meters dramatically. Compressors can also suck the life out of a part completely if used too much. Here, as we crank the threshold setting, you can hear the compressor really clamping down on the part. In this case, it destroys all the natural dynamics and breath and life of the part completely. As we return to the -3 dB total reduction, things start to sound better. Tube compressors are great for adding weight and the appearance of volume and sustain without sending the meters into the red if used sparingly. The next category is the opto-style compressors, and these can also be tube compressors as well, and one of the most beloved of all is the original Teletronics LA2A. This was a unique compressor because it featured an electro-optical attenuator, a T4 cell, which is really just a light bulb, and a tube-based amplification stage that varies the compressor's response based on the frequency of the input signal. This is well known for providing incredibly smooth compression and a really warm sound. The LA2A became a staple in recording studios for its musical and transparent compression, and for uses anything that has a lot of harmonic content that changes over time. Optocompressors are incredibly useful for things like bass guitar. Also for things like vocals and drum buses, acoustic piano, and even voiceovers. Anything that has rich harmonic content that varies over time. The LA2A was a master at controlling these with musical warmth and lots of subtle tube saturation. In this example, we're using the Opto-style LA2A on a bass guitar that covers a lot of octave range, and as such is missing some mid-range punch in the mix.
But every time that you pull me in, I wind up on the floor. Something about the sting of it keeps me coming back for more.
Because of the Opto-style, LA2A compressor can change its response based on the incoming frequencies it sees. Listen to how the high and low end of the bass guitar are evened out, giving the bass more presence and punch in the mid-range.
But every time that you pull me in, I wind up on the floor. Something about the sting of it keeps me coming back for more. Tell me.
This is just one of the reasons why the LA2A or Opto-style compressors are so sought after for bass guitar. Next up is the FET style compressors, or the field effect transistor technology compressors. And without a doubt, the most beloved of all of these was the original URI 1176. It was released in the 1960s and created by Bill Putnam Sr. as the solid-state successor to his original tube-based 176 limiting amplifier. FET style compressors are unique in that they usually don't have a threshold setting. They're driven by the strength of the input signal. Known for its incredibly fast attack and release, the 1176 became popular for its ability to add character, aggression, and punch to just about any audio signal. The 1176 can be incredibly transparent if needed, but it's most widely used for adding incredible grit and aggression to vocals, for taming and tone shaping things like snare drums, taming highly dynamic instruments like percussion, taming out-of-control transients on a drum bus, and even adding aggression and texture to bass guitar. The 1176 really is one of the most versatile and flexible style compressors ever made. And a great example of that is how effective it can be on transforming the sound of a snare drum. Here we have an acoustic snare drum recording, and we're going to be using the 1176 to extend the decay of the snare drum to make it more explosive in the mix. This is possible because the 1176 gives us such precise control over the attack and release controls, and the ratio buttons as well. We have much more specific control over the ratios and even the all buttons in, which is a completely different characteristic of ratio setting. By slowing down the attack time to allow the start of the snare to sneak through the compressor and speeding up the release time so that there's almost no release whatsoever, we get that explosive, lengthened, or decayed snare sound. With these settings, just adjusting the release characteristic by itself gives us complete control over the decay of the snare drum. And the last of our hardware compressor style categories is the VCA, or voltage controlled amplifier style. This emerging new technology allowed companies like DBX and SSL to build VCA style compressors with much more precise control over things like the attack, release, and threshold, and ratio settings, and knee settings. In the 1980s, Solid State Logic, or SSL, introduced the G-Series bus compressor, which marked a shift towards solid-state technology and became synonymous with high-end mixing consoles and modern music production. So you often see VCA-style compressors most commonly on the master bus or on groups of instruments, but they can also be used on guitars, basses, drums especially, and even vocals, and mostly because they just offer surgical control over all the different compressor features that all modern music technology requires. In this example, we're going to use a VCA-style compressor on our master bus for our total mix. This is the G-Master bus compressor from Solid State Logic, and it is exceptionally good at reining in dynamics of a total mix, as well as gluing the overall mix together and adding weight and density to the overall sound.
They said, we know there's whiskey, we aim to find it. Your lovers ran off, he ain't here to mind it. Mama just fired back, better turn yourselves around. Or there'll be fire to the left, smoke to the right. Neighbors gonna say it was a hell of a fight. Shattered all the windows from miles around. Mama just smiled, stood there holding that shotgun. She said, sometimes you gotta stand your ground.
Typically, bus compressors are not set very heavy-handedly. The threshold control usually is set so that the total amount of gain reduction is somewhere between 4 and 5 dB, and then the attack and release settings are set according to the material that you're actually mixing. Slower attack and release settings for more mellow styles of music like orchestral, instrumental, and jazz, and much faster attack and release settings for more aggressive music.
Know there's whiskey, we aim to find it. Your lovers ran off, he ain't here to mind it. Mama just fired back, better turn yourselves around. Or there'll be fire to the left, smoke to the right. Neighbors gonna say it was a hell of a fight. Shattered all the windows from miles around. Mama just smiled, stood there holding that shotgun.
Just like any other compressor, if used in its extreme settings, it can crush the life out of a mix just as easily as it can improve it. And because its release characteristics are so specific, this compressor has an auto-release feature if you want the compressor to auto-detect the best release settings for your particular mix.
So as you can see in here, compressors can be really creative tools for your overall mix process because they can cover so much ground and they can cover so many different duties, unlike maybe specifically EQs or something like that that have a much more surgical kind of use for things. Compressors can really be a chameleon in a modern day mix. Hey, thanks for hanging out with me today, you guys. I really appreciate it. If you learned something or if this was helpful in any way, please hit the subscription and notification bells. It really does help keep the channel going, and it helps me make more videos like this. Stay safe, be creative, add something creative to the world. I could really use it. We'll catch you guys in the next video.